Bulls Gold is delivered to you via the Barroom Network, now in its 7th year of providing podcasts about Chicago sports, movies, and more. Make sure to subscribe to the Barroom Network for free and easy downloads of its programming, and visit its merchandising store at deepdishtees.com to purchase t-shirts, hoodies, and mugs. Now, on with the show.
Hey, welcome to Bulls Gold here on the Barroom Network. I'm Edward Schuler, joined by Salim Sudawala. Salim, how you doing today, man?
Hey, Ed, I'm doing great. Bulls have been playing better. I know they had a couple of annoying losses, though, where you thought they were back to their old bad tricks when they had that frustrating loss to like the Wizards when like half their Wizards roster gone, and then like they got blown out by the Rockets. But outside of that, like since that Minnesota game, they're what, like 11-6. I think they have like the 13th rated offense in that span, 8th rated defense. Like Zach, Vooch, and DeMar for the first time, it feels like in general, have like a net positive on net rating together. I think they're +5 together in that span. So yeah, it's been well for the Bulls, and yeah, like I said, I'm doing well as well.
Yeah, the Bulls are playing really well. 11-6 in their last 17, as you mentioned, since the Minnesota game, and maybe that Washington game was a little bit of a flashback to that kind of losing to a Washington team without a lot of their key players, but they have been playing well since then. They won 3 when they beat Brooklyn and Philly and Utah, lost 3 after that, won 3. So I don't know if this is the start of another losing streak or not. But I think these games are important because you're playing teams that you have a reasonable chance to beat, right? But it's just getting in that mindset of playing the Pacers on a Tuesday night and the Hornets on a Thursday night, and then you're going to play Orlando on Friday. So it's a lot of games where it's like they're all easily games where the Bulls could slip up if they fall into their prior ways. But we'll see how they fare in these games. But yeah, we got a lot to talk. We have a lot to talk about on this episode. We're going to get into how they've looked recently, as you mentioned. DeRozan, Levine, and Vooch, they've all been playing together. I think this is really like the first real stretch where they've all been playing together really well at the same time, and it's really been giving the team a lift. So when your best players are playing like this, it's giving some sort of a response. So we're gonna get into that. We're going to talk about the direction the team is going to go into as we approach the NBA trade deadline in a few weeks. And it's always been a point of conversation with the rebuild and retool and whatever direction people want to go in with this team. But as they sit here, still a few games out of 500, I think it's safe to say that they're in a position where they need to look to improve. So we're going to get into a few things. And joining us and returning to the show, he covers the NBA for Dime Up Rocks. He also writes for Liberty Ballers and SB Nation. Jackson Frank. Jackson, thank you for joining us again, man.
Yeah, happy to be out. I'm glad I could come during a stretch where the Bulls are looking good and enjoyable. We can talk about a lot of the nice parts about this team.
Yeah, I think it might be like a sign. Like the last time we had you on, the Bulls were at their peak playing. They were like first in the East, and then now you're back on, and like ironically, the Bulls are starting to play well again. So maybe we need to have you on like a lot more, and the Bulls can keep this playing well.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'll have to, I guess I bring the good mojo for the Bulls and their fans.
Yeah, we're glad you didn't join during like darker times. Like there have been some tough moments this season where it was, get rid of everyone, do a hard rebuild, blow it up, and, all of those things. But, the Bulls have been playing better basketball, still 22-24 on the season. Overall, the picture is kind of like a middling team, which I think was probably I think it's fair to say that was the expectation this season, that this Bulls team was probably going to be middle of the road, capable of beating anyone, capable of losing to anyone. And so far, that's proven to be true. So, let's start with this. Based on like what you've seen so far of a team this season, what are the things that have stuck out to you about how this team has played in terms of like again, we talked about Levine and DeRozan and Vooch have all been really on the same page for, I think, the first time in a while. So they've been playing well, and they've gotten some good contributions from a few of the veterans they brought in as well, with Dragic and Drummond too. So like the team is playing better, but as a whole, the team is just still kind of middling. But what are the things that have stuck out to you when you've watched this team play?
Yeah, I would say I'm surprised how well the defense has held up. Just looking at cleaning the glass stuff, they're 11th in points per possession allowed. Top 10 turnover rate, pretty good rebounding team. Kind of the things we expected last year, but last year, when Lonzo went down, I know some of that coincided with Caruso being out. The defense really faltered, and Caruso's generally stayed healthy, but Lonzo, obviously hasn't played at all. So I've been surprised that they're kind of still teetering on that top 10 unit side of things. So that's what stood out to me. The offense is quite middle of the road, just with the lack of shooting, and there's not a ton of great passing talent, I think, on it, which hamstrings them. But when this roster was put together a year and a half ago, it was the idea there's going to be a really, really, really good offense. And of course, part of that was Lonzo's transition game, his shooting, his passing. But the fact that it's still been, skewed toward a defense first team, despite some issues, with guys like DeMar and Levine and kind of Vooch's limitations, I think has been impressive for sure. And I think that's what's interesting. But at the same time, it's not every night that they're winning with the defense, right? It's sometimes it's a Vooch big game, or it's a Levine big game, or DeMar's doing this thing. So I think that's what's most interesting is it's a defense first team, but it's not a team that can only win with the defense. And that's, I think, just based on kind of the narratives around this team, rightfully and unrightfully over the past year and a half, that has been a bit surprising through 46 games.
Yeah, I think the defensive end, I definitely agree with you. It's been surprising, especially when you consider their big three, if you will. Well, not if you will, they are their big three. The Vooch, DeMar, and Zach are not, like you mentioned, not defensive oriented players. What have been your thoughts on those three? Like I mentioned, in this 17-game span, there seems like they finally learned to really play with each other, play off each other, I should say. And they're starting, like I said, to be a net positive. And on a nightly basis, they are leading the team in scoring, because obviously that's their strength. What is your thoughts been on them and how has this season gone on, shown to you at least?
Yeah, I think, what's a key part of, them kind of riding the ship over the last month or so is I think Levine looks a lot more like the guy that we saw for a year and a half, right? The first year in the All-Star game, and then before the knee injuries really started to plague him last season. He just looks more explosive. I think that's allowing him to play on the ball a little more and just merge his on and off ball talents better. I think he's shown some good chemistry and rapport with Vucevic. Vucevic is having a really, really nice year offensively, shooting almost 60% from 2-point range. I think his career high before this was like 54%. Been really useful, especially punishing smaller teams inside. You think back to, a couple of their wins against the Bulls, their win against the Warriors. It's kind of been on the back of Vooch doing this stuff inside and, spacing the floor as well. So I think that's really what stands out to me with DeMar. It's just kind of DeMar being DeMar again, the clutch shots, the mid-range jumpers, the foul drawing, things like that. But I think kind of the reason that they have been able to weather some of the injuries, not to discredit DeMar, but it's Vooch having a bounce back season offensively, and Levine over the past month and a half starting to find his footing again and looked like that really potent scorer that became a star back starting with 2021.
Yeah, I think, and Vooch in particular, he's arguably having his second best season, at least like in efficiency wise too. He has, I think, actually his best efficiency wise season. Like his true shooting percentage is over 60%. And a lot of the stuff that he's doing, a lot of times with him getting involved more on the offensive end, just because he is their best playmaker. Like you mentioned, they don't have a lot of good passing, but him being one of their only really good instinctual passers, uh, getting him more touches overall. And I know the conversation kind of becomes a sticker point when it's to talk about his post touches, and people kind of get kind of wrapped up in that old thought process. Well, it's not a modern game to get a lot of post play out of in today's game and trying to force post ups. But in general, it's just about getting him touches overall, and from there he's able to play make. What have been your thoughts on Vooch in general, in particular, as far as getting those touches and in particular maybe even in the post or high post and facilitating from that area?
Yeah, like I said, I think Vooch is having a really nice year. I do think he's struggled, more defensively than even I saw last year, but I think it's more than been overshadowed by the offensive development. And I think I don't feel as though his post touches are like oversaturated. It feels like there's a healthy balance that when Chicago sees a mismatch for him inside, it prioritizes feeding the ball. It's not an Embiid or a Jokic thing, right? Where he's going to get the ball in the block a lot, regardless who's defending him. It's okay. Do we get a mismatch after a 2-man game, or do they just have a smaller guy inside that he can exploit? Okay, now let's look to get him the ball. It's not okay. Regardless of the play and the circumstances, we're going to have the first touch be Vooch. I think that's what's helping him and the offense just kind of stay afloat. In those, just in general, right? And like I said, they're middling offense, but yes, that's what stands out.
One other thing that I think has really contributed to this good play that the Bulls have been on has been, and Salim has talked about it in like some of our past shows, is Coby White has looked like really solid coming off the bench. He's been consistently playing well. He's shooting the ball well. I think his team defense overall has been pretty competent. And I think he's starting to show flashes more like consistent flashes of that player that we saw, like, I think it was kind of between like maybe like late November and like January-ish of last season, where he was like just shooting the ball well, really solid team defense. And he even had like a few of those games in the playoffs as well. So like we came into the season thinking that Coby White, like it was pretty much over for him as far as being a rotational player for this team. And obviously some injuries have been able to keep him involved in a rotation, but he's done his part. Like he's held up his end of the deal, and he looks like a really solid player. What do you think about how Coby White has looked this season? And do you think that this is like, do you think there's even like more room for him to grow even like further than that?
Yeah, that's encouraging to hear, because I feel like when I've caught Bulls games this year and Coby's been in the rotation, he's been healthy, he's looked pretty good to me. And this isn't for me to like say that I just base things off metrics, but then I go look at some of the metrics and they're not kind of Coby. So I'm wondering, like, I'm wondering, am I just catching him on the right days? And maybe Bulls fans and analysts aren't, particularly enthused by him, but for you to heap praise on him is nice. That aligns with my sample, which obviously is much more limited than yours. But I think what Coby's done well that this year, then they go hand in hand, is he's become a better decision maker with the ball in his hands, and that's helped him inside the arc as well. Just in just kind of the way he handles things inside the arc. He's shooting 55% on twos, and that's a career high. He hasn't been as good from deep this year as he was the last couple of years, but and he also has is a larger volume in the sense that is a much higher 3-point rate than he had in prior years. So I think he's looked solid. He's had some, like you mentioned, some really useful plays on the ball defensively. He's not particularly stout guy, but he is 6'5". He does have some kind of jitteriness about him laterally in short area space. So I think he's looked like a fine rotation guard. I think he still is prone to like
is like he's trying to either see the game in a unique lens, and that makes him do some stuff that you scratch your head at, or he can still get sped up at times when he thinks, okay, this is how the defense is going to respond, and this is what I'm going to do. When the defense doesn't respond that way, he looks kind of out of sorts. So I think that just kind of continuing to be like what's the phrase, that he continuing to be adaptable, when he's working inside the arc rather than a little bit pre-planned, which I think he's gotten better at, but there are still instances where you want more from him. But yeah, I think Coby's had a pretty dang solid fourth year. And he's, just kind of, he had some nice stretches last year as well. And so I think overall you have to be fairly encouraged about kind of his prospects long-term, not necessarily in the sense of, okay, this guy's going to, be a star, or even maybe necessarily a starter, but a guy who can definitely help you on solid teams, and gives you some floor spacing, gives you some closeout attacking, has issues defensively, but I think still, like I said, still does have some good awareness and and capabilities on the ball, and doing some low man help, playing the passing lanes at times too. So yeah, I think by and large, Coby's had a really solid year, and I am curious, to see how he progresses from here and he keeps going, because it's he's only 22, I think, or maybe he's turned 23,
yeah.
But
22.
Yeah, so I think he's definitely in a good spot, and I don't want to make any declarations about who he'll be long term, but I certainly feel much better about him having put together some pretty good stretches of play the last couple of years than maybe we felt after year two.
Yeah, I think so. A couple of things with the metrics, and I'm with you, because I watched Coby all year, and he started off rough a little bit, and I would say the last month to 6 weeks, he's picked it up, and I think the reason the metrics don't really show improvement is because the usage is not high enough. So I think that probably factors into it. But yeah, like you said, I think people kind of still get stuck up in the fact that he's the 7th overall pick. Mm-hmm. So the expectations versus for when you generally expect the 7th overall pick, you think, okay, we're drafting a starter, at least, like the starting caliber player generally in that area. But in the end, you kind of have to let go of those expectations, just start analyzing the player for what he is, and he has improved, and he's showing that, look, he can be this guy that can contribute and help you win games, and like with the shooting, like I said, the most improvement, like you mentioned too, is defense. I've been kind of impressed with how much better he's gotten on screen navigations. Like that was probably like the worst, and not to say he's good and not on as a point of attack defender by any means, but I've seen the improvement where he doesn't get hung up on screens quite as often that he used to. And I feel like that's been a really nice surprise on that end. The other young player on this team that kind of gets scrutinized a lot, and that one being Patrick Williams. I think, the Patrick Williams discourse is gotten really chaotic amongst Bulls fans, where there's a lot of people that are already out on him. I know there's mutual friends of ours that you talk to often, I believe, Chris Amundsen and Laro Golden. Shout out to those guys, but they're on more my side of thinking, where we're seeing good development from Patrick, and as the season going on, and there's more nuance involved in how you analyze a guy like Patrick Williams, who was a lot more raw coming into this league, and especially trying to, with the time he's missed due to injury, and trying to incorporate him with chemistry and all that is concerned, playing with Zach, DeMar, and Vooch. I feel like I'm pretty happy with where Pat is at personally. I would love to hear your thoughts on the stuff you've seen from Patrick Williams. And like where you see how his season's going, and what your expectations should still be for him in the future.
Yeah, I really liked what I've seen from Pat Will this year. It's hard to overstate kind of how difficult a situation he's been put in. He was drafted as a 4th overall pick on a team that wasn't particularly good even his rookie year. And then, they immediately shift the timeline and he has a different role. And then he has an injury. And when he comes back, the team still looks different because now Lonzo's out. Now in his third year, Lonzo's still out. And then also on top of it, the team's kind of OG franchise cornerstone, Zach LaVine, is in a different space because of his own knee injury. So it's like any player generally needs stability and of context. I don't think Pat's really had that for a long stretch. Both, just with, like I said, just all the different kind of players he's had around him and the circumstances. And so that's been tough. But yeah, I think he looks, I've been really impressed with him defensively. I think he's getting even better and aggressive as a helper. I think his defense in space on the ball continues to improve. That was a clear sign of weakness for him at Florida State coming into the draft. And I think, I wouldn't say he's really, really good moving in space, but I think he's much better than he was, 2.5 years ago. So that's encouraging. He still continues to he's taking a lot more threes this year than he did in prior years, and he's still hitting them at 40% clip. There are the sequences where he can be frustrating and maybe he's too hesitant or things like that, but they are put under a microscope because of the win now situation that Chicago has thrust this team in. The front office has thrust the team into, and that's a really tough spot to be for any young player, let alone one like Pat, who clearly had an intriguing bundle of skills, as a prospect, but had to kind of refine a lot of them, and that takes exploring what you can and can't do, and it doesn't always look pretty when like I said, when you're on a team who's has Alex Caruso and Nikola Vucevic and DeMar DeRozan and Zach LaVine. So I get that, but I've liked kind of some of the versatile usage we've seen from him at times. As a role man, I think he's finishing more aggressively when he gets those chances. You're seeing him kind of test things out as a ball handler in transition, getting into that pull-up jumper he likes from usually the right elbow. He's a little more aggressive there, getting to the rim too, in those situations. So, I think if you stripped away the context of Chicago being win now, and it was just a guy that, was on a 14-13 win team, the progress would look really, really nice and people would be pretty encouraged by it. But because some of those mistakes and those trial and error decisions from him, happen on a team that's trying to win immediately with a roster that's got some injury prone guys in their prime, or not injury prone, just guys dealing with injuries in their prime, that kind of magnifies those mistakes as being frustrating. And I get it, but it's a reminder that, that Pat is super young. He hasn't necessarily even played that much NBA basketball still, and has done it in a variety of contexts. So yeah, I would be encouraged long term by Pat, even if it's not necessarily he's in 2 months he's going to be a guy that's just giving you the he's not necessarily going to be the guy that is turning games, key games, whether it's a play-in, playoff game, playoff series, but a guy that in a couple of years from now, whichever direction Chicago takes, assuming he's still in town, is going to be really good. And so I've every Bulls game I've caught this year, for the most part, I've liked what Pat Will's done. At least there's stretches where you can see the vision, and there are certainly stretches where he goes quiet and makes a mistake on defense, and it's like, that's frustrating. I don't know, is that just a flash in the pan from earlier? But yeah, I've liked a lot of what Pat's done this year, and I think he's progressing nicely given kind of his developmental context and how arduous it's been.
Yeah, would you agree that his baseline, as far as his floor, is probably a good defender and a good spot up shooter? That's probably his baseline. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I am curious to kind of see what level of he gets at in terms of how he bends a defense as a shooter. But yeah, I think he's a good defender. He's definitely made encouraging strides as a shooter. Like I said, his 3-point rate's at a career high. He's taken a few more shots per game this year. But you look at, at least compared to last year, but you look at his rookie year, took 7.4 shots per game, only 1.9 threes. That's roughly 25% of your shots are threes. This year, 8.2 shots per game, 3.5 of them are threes. So you're looking at closer to 40% of your shots being threes, and he's shooting 42% this year versus 39 as a rookie. So it's hard to increase volume and maintain or increase efficiency as well, kind of in any sort of shot you take, for the most part, assuming they're coming in the same way, unassisted versus assisted, but in terms of play types as well. But yeah, I think that's a good baseline. And now for Pat, it's just a matter of can we get that offense to be consistent? Can we scale you up in 2 years to be a guy who's taking 12 shots and 5 threes a game versus the 8-3 now. Can you be a guy that is, a really, really good low man who can occasionally be really good on the ball as well? Can you play the nail? So it's, because obviously, defense is a fluid thing, right? It's not just, it's not just one certain, you're a good defender means you're a good defender in every context and every role. So for me with Pat, it's just a matter of these stretches that you have, whether it's game to game or possession by possession, look really encouraging. Can we have those kind of be what you do every single possession when you're out there? And that's what I'm still looking more for from Pat. But I really have liked what I've seen this year. And it's hard not to be encouraged from a developmental perspective. I think just with some of these stretches that he has that are like kind of subtly dominant, right? Not like he's not dicing up the defense as a passer or shutting down the superstar scorer of the team, but there are long stretches that happen in certain games with Pat where he's impacting every possession pretty significantly. And that's an impressive place to play as a 21-year-old with only, 130 games under his belt.
Yeah, I think, another thing I always, like the nuance of analyzing a player's development. Like, I think a lot of people get stuck on like the box score numbers, and if, the numbers are showing that's the development. But like, I think like, especially when you talk about defense, part of development, I think, is learning how to defend on the NBA level, because the offenses are so advanced nowadays, especially with a lot of the movement and the play sets that are happening. It's not just about like effort on defense anymore. It's also about knowing when to help out, what rotations to make. And that's part of development for me as well. And I feel like I've seen that from Pat this season. Mm-hmm. Like sometimes those things don't show up in the box score. Like when he's knows when to help out, like on the nail, or when he spots the Spain pick and roll happening and kind of knows where to move with and defend, be right in this right spot to defend. I think that part kind of can get unnoticed as well. And I feel like that's part of a player's development too.
Mm-hmm. I think he's much more sure of himself defensively, and that can sound cliche, but especially off the ball, when he commits to a decision, he is committed to it, right? Where I feel like there's been times to detriment the first, 2 years where he would maybe see a rotation, but he wouldn't know if it was the right thing, even if he thought it was. And now it's like he's playing the weak side corner. He sees that it's his tag. He's aggressively there, and he's there in 1.3 seconds rather than 1.7. And basketball, that can be the difference between preventing a pass or breaking up a lob or stealing a pocket pass and not, or altering a shot. So that's one thing that stands out to me this year, is just in general, and especially on defenses, which is kind of where Pat is going to hang his hat initially, or at least primarily. It's just a lot more self-assurance and kind of knowing what he's supposed to do. And yeah, I agree about the effort. Like, you can, let's say you're guarding a really good, a really good driver, but who's a tenuous shooter. You can fight over a screen really well, but if that gets them downhill, that wasn't necessarily the right thing to do, right? You have to understand, what each specific context requires. And I think Pat is getting better at that. And that is something that maybe isn't quantifiable, especially because like defense is not a one-man act. You can make a great rotation or make a good stunt or navigate a screen well, but if one or two other guys break something down, like maybe it doesn't reflect in the team's defensive rating when you're on the floor, or the team's rim frequency when you're on the floor, things like that. So I think and obviously again, like the Bulls are a pretty solid defensive team, but yeah, I think that's important, that just Pat looks good, and I think he's getting more aggressive offensive too. Like I said, he seems to be hunting a shot a little bit more and getting a little more freedom. So I like a lot of what I've seen from Pat, even if there are still stretches where you want more, but then you have to take a step back and realize he's in a context that necessarily isn't the best for development at his age, or maybe not that, but like, what I mean? It's not it can lead to some, just frustrations and whatnot.
No, 100%. Yeah, it's not ideal for a younger raw player to play it with such high usage players, because if you're a role player that already knows his place in this league and what your bread and butter is, it's easier to play off of guys like that. But when you're a young player developing, still learning his own game, learning the game overall itself, that can become a problem, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think, that's a difficult. Like finding your role, like especially for secondary guys, even for stars and whatnot, is a really challenging thing. It's even hard, like, and that's something that every prospect has to find out. That's something that's a little easier for someone like, let's say, a Corey Kispert, right, who played 4 years at Gonzaga, was a really good shooter, really good cutter, like, and has those 4 years. He knows kind of his job. Whereas Pat Will plays one truncated season at Florida State. He comes out. He's one of the youngest players in the draft. I think he might have been the youngest collegiate player that year, because I think
I think American. I think I said it was American-born player or something like that. He was.
Well, yeah, because I think maybe like because LaMelo might have been a little younger, but obviously he played in Australia. But point being, like that's a whole different ballgame, right? Like it's gonna take Kispert versus Pat Will like a much different kind of acclimation period to figure out their ideal role. So yeah, I think Pat's in a good spot, and I hope for the sake of like you two and other Bulls fans that it gets to happen in Chicago. But I think regardless, like Pat is on a good developmental path, just kind of the way he's handling things. And he's one of my favorite. He's like the last few Bulls games I've caught. He's been one of my favorite parts of watching those games, because he just looks a much more impactful player than he did even in October, and that's a really encouraging place to be. Half a year into your third season, which is basically I think your second season, you kind of call it for Pat, given the number of games he's played.
Yeah, it better happen in Chicago, Jackson, because I'm telling you, if I see another Wendell Carter or Lowry marketing situation happen, I'm gonna lose it.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of why I'm saying for Bulls fans' sake. So, but yeah, I think Pat is developing into the sort of player that fits really well around this core, especially if he continue to sustain his increased volume from three and effectiveness. I don't know if he has to necessarily be a 42% guy for his entire career, but if he could be a guy who is taking 5 or 6 a game and shooting 38, 39%. And probably closer to 39. Like, I think that's a really nice spot to be. And so, yeah, I just, as I've said multiple times now during this little segment, I really like what Pat Will is doing.
Yeah, I think I think it raises like a really good question now in terms of direction, because I think one of the interesting things last year is that the Bulls were playing really well, but some of the young players were not. So like it was easier to throw guys' names out there like, yeah, like I don't have a problem seeing Patrick Williams traded, or yeah, we can trade Coby White too. But now the team isn't, they're more middle of the road, and Patrick Williams and Coby White are playing really well. So I think there's a little bit more hesitance, and I would argue in Patrick Williams' case that there's really no way you could trade him right now unless you were getting like a really significant return on something. But it still points you into a question of what this team can do in the next couple of weeks to improve as a basketball team, as they sit kind of clumped in with all of these like teams like Miami and New York and like Indiana, like just all these teams clumped up and trying to either get into that 6 or really try and like increase their spot in the play-in. So we know this team isn't going to rebuild, but what do you think realistically they can do approaching the trade deadline to improve? Like, can they add a shooter? Can they add maybe another wing that can give them a little bit more depth? Like, what are things that they can do realistically to improve as a team?
Yeah, I think some sort of wing shooting would be nice. I think that's just really important. Like I mentioned kind of earlier, it would be interesting to see if they could find kind of a sort of connective passer. I know that's kind of the role Lonzo played. It's the role that Vooch plays in a big man's body. Vooch obviously plays a little more on the ball in the sense that he can collapse defenses in the post and create from there and do a little bit off the dribble. But I think those would be kind of my 2 biggest priorities. I don't know like how attainable like getting a lot better defensively is, because what they're kind of missing to me is any sort of rim protection, and like you're not going to find a center better than Vooch. Like I think Vooch is having a really nice year. You just have to accept his limitations, and that secondary kind of that roaming 4 rim protector, I think, is the role that you could see Patrick Williams playing down the line. So again, I don't think he doesn't fulfill that right now, which is fine because he's 21 years old. He's played a season and a half of NBA basketball, but that's kind of where I struggle to see them really taking a big leap defensively with any of the moves I might prioritize. So that's why I would go for kind of, can you upgrade the passing talent for the rotation? Can you find any sort of shooter who's, I guess, maybe like a little bit viable defensively, because, the kind of the two guys that play a lot off the bench that are wing size, maybe I'm forgetting a guy, but, that'd be, Javonte Green and Derrick Jones Jr., excuse me. They're not commanding respect from deep, but they're also, they have some utility defensively to varying degrees. And so that's where I wonder, like, can you just get a little more space around these guys that doesn't necessarily add another really, really what's a defender kind of really puts further strain on guys like Caruso and Pat and Io.
Are there any players that kind of like jump out to you that you would immediately think of that fit that bill?
Yeah, I think, he's not necessarily an on-ball guy, but a guy like Robert Covington, I think, is still really, really impressive, his instincts and playmaking off the ball. He's generally been out of the Clippers rotation, I believe, this year. So I wonder if there's anything interesting there. It's tough because the Clippers have some guys that make sense to some other, fellow playoff contenders, but because they're in their own kind of immediate win now window, it's tough. But I think he makes some sense. I think someone like Doug McDermott maybe doesn't necessarily fit the mold of defensively tenable, but is obviously quite a high level shooter with wing size. I don't know if there's enough creativity in the Bulls offensive scheme to fully maximize his, movement shooting and shooting versatility, just, to make use of the defensive trade-off that you'd have if you're playing over, guys like Devontae or Derrick Jones. So those are a couple that come to mind, but yeah, I have to think about it a little deeper, but there's certainly guys that make sense. So those are two that kind of just immediately, pop off the board in my head. But yeah, I don't know exactly, just especially because it's tough because it seems like there's a lot of teams that are still in contention for at least a play-in spot and want to continue to act as such. So it maybe dampens the market or skews it more towards a buyer's market, which is the perspective we're discussing this from for the Bulls. So just a couple of names to keep in mind, but just kind of the general archetypes of wing shooting that can hold up a bit defensively, and that connective passing, that role that Vooch and Lonzo played well, and especially kind of when that offense was clicking, two things that they had going a lot.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting just because like the obstacle for the Bulls is if, depending on what you trade, it doesn't make sense because like right now, I think the easier contract to move is that Coby White, just because he's going into unrestricted free agency. It'll be like a tough pill to swallow to move a player like Caruso, because obviously how important he is to the defense. But yeah, I think that's the biggest obstacle right now because the Bulls just don't have a lot of like contracts that you want to easily kind of give up. I mean, like you have DJJ, but he's only making like $3 million. Obviously Drummond, who's making like $3 million. So like you'd almost have to combine a lot of different small contracts, and then at that point it might not be enough to match some of the players that like Covington and McDermott, who make like 12 to 13 million a year. I guess like what would you think? Let's say if the Bulls traded Coby and like DJJ to, I don't know if the Clippers would take it, but to let's say to the Clippers, to Covington, would you think that'd be a good trade for the Bulls, that you're giving up shooting and with what Coby brings with shooting? And I think like DJJ has been a good backup small ball five as like a rim running small ball five. Do you think that'd be good for the Bulls, or do you think that's something like you got to kind of weigh the cons as well that might overweigh the positives?
Yeah, I don't know if that necessarily kind of moves them in any significant direction, because like Covington isn't like a great shooter, but he is someone who, because of his volume and quick release, tends to at least garner closeouts. But you're not just replacing Coby shooting with Covington shooting, because they play completely different positions, and your guard depth beyond Levine is pretty devoid of floor spacing. So that would be tough to me. But if you could supplement that with like the acquisition of a guy like Alec Burks, from the Pistons, who I'd imagine is available, a guy who shot like 40% from three the last 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And he's pretty good defense. Like he's not a bad defender either.
Yeah, I feel like I might be a little lower on his defense, but just like, but if it, you know what I mean? Like if you could, those could be two kind of corresponding moves, then I'd be like, okay, yeah, like yes, it'd be a bit of a bummer to lose that small ball option with Derek Jones Jr., who gives you some rim pressure, but you still have that guard shooting, and you can handle the ball a little bit as well, and then you would also get that guy in coverage, who can just kind of play into the defensive scheme of we're going to be aggressive and help. We're going to force turnovers. We're going to play the nail a lot, trying to roam as much as we can between the nail and kind of playing the wing back to shooters. So, yeah, that's kind of what I would be looking at, right? Like if we're going to move Coby, which I think is like by no means the untouchable, you still want to, can we get at least something to supplement the shooting from him, even if we have to just delegate more ball handling responsibility to a Levine, maybe an Io. DeRozan obviously handled the ball a lot already, but like if we have ways to kind of supplement that, that would be something I'm interested in, because I just do think that shooting is a pretty, glaring shortcoming of this roster, especially in the backcourt beyond Levine and Coby. So if you're moving Coby, can you find a way to at least replicate some of what he brings as a floor spacer and mitigate some of his shortcomings, just with sometimes the decision making and whatnot. But yeah, so I don't know if I love that move. I think it's a fine move in a vacuum, but as we mentioned, like these moves don't exist in a vacuum. But I don't think it's untenable to find some way to replace Coby shooting from the guard position for 15, 16 minutes a night if that's what you're looking for.
What do you think about someone like a Jalen McDaniels of the Hornets? I mean, there's been like rumors that he's available. I'm not sure what the price is, but like he seems to fit like most of the things that the Bulls could really use. And someone that they could really add to this team to make them better. But I mean, what do you think? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so he's a guy who typically when I watch Hornets games doesn't get guarded as a shooter. He's shooting below league average from three, but in the last couple of years right around league average. But not a guy that I think defenses tend to respect. So just kind of for the two of you, keeping that in mind. Like, are you ready for another rangy wing who doesn't get guard on the weak side? But he definitely has some on-ball chops defensively. I don't think, his body control and lateral quickness are anywhere close as good as his younger brother, Jaden, which, obviously Jaden is one of the premier perimeter defenders these days, but just kind of, I think there are some similarities, but that's where I think Jalen falls short. I think his instincts aren't as good. I think he's worth kind of a flyer from an on-court sense. But I just don't know with the Bulls, it makes sense because of kind of his lack of shooting gravity and the fact that ideally I think Pat Will could kind of fill a lot of those needs long term, because I don't think Jalen's by any means like some established player. I think he's very much kind of still in that Pat Will realm of figuring out who he is and how he makes it happen on a possession by possession basis. So I don't love that for the Bulls, just just because of the two things I mentioned there, that he's still a pretty big development guy and doesn't garner respect as a shooter, despite kind of increasing his volume this year, in spite of, lessened efficiency from last year. So I get the appeal for some teams, but I don't think it makes sense for Chicago. I just don't think that he's an upgrade, immediately over guys like Javonte or Derek Jones Jr. I don't think he has more promise in a similar role than Pat Will does.
Okay, so Jackson, looking at the East, that bottom 6 to even 10 in the East, and looking at the playoff race, the Bulls currently are stacked to have the 5th easiest remaining schedule after starting off with one of the most brutal schedules in the league. And seeing that none of the teams ahead of them are really put a stranglehold on any sort of winning streak or whatever have you. And I think the Bulls might probably are playing the best ball of any of those teams in this last month span. What would how confident do you feel that of them making the playoffs at this point? Or maybe even kind of sneaking into that 6th seed to avoid the play-in?
Yeah, I think for me, I don't think I'd have them among my top 8. I think I like the top 7 as currently is. I think those tended to me are the top 7. The Hawks continue to be really tough to figure out. The Pacers, it feels like, they've lost 7 in a row. They've kind of been in a tailspin without Halliburton around. And I could see that, I could see them with this tailspin, moving off some of their veterans that, have helped them thus far. But so I think to me, to me, I see that 8th spot as a race between Atlanta and Chicago right now. It's really tough for me to say one way or the other. I think they're very much of similar quality. Clearly kind of they've got some star power, but they're clearly very flawed teams. So I don't feel great about. I definitely wouldn't pick the Bulls to vault into the top 6. I know the Heat haven't been great, but that defense is really good. Bam's still really good. Jimmy Butler is excellent. I like what the Knicks have done too. I know the Knicks are on a losing streak, but I think they've generally been playing pretty good basketball this year. So I can't pick between the Hawks and the Bulls. I probably lean the Hawks just because I think. I just think they've got a little more to them. Maybe I'm off, but I think they've had a little bit more of the injury bug, excluding Lonzo, of course. But Capella's missed a good amount of time. Collins has missed some time and is dealing with some injuries. So I would lean Atlanta, but I'm not at all I could easily be swayed on that. It's by no means a hardline stand. I think they're a very similar quality, and it's maybe just partly a matter of Atlanta having a 1-game lead. That could be the decide. I know there's still 34 to go for both, or for Atlanta, and 36 for the Bulls. But yeah, I would lean Atlanta just barely, but I definitely see them in the same exact stratosphere.
Yeah, Hawks and Bulls every Hawks and Bulls game has been pretty much
down to the wire,
a fight.
Yeah. Except
there's
last
2
night,
games that came down to I think last possession. So yeah.
So let me ask you this: if the Bulls, let's say the Bulls either miss the playoffs flat out or they just get bounced in the play-in, they're in a very interesting position, obviously, because they have a lot of vets in their prime who are still really good players. DeMar is still playing at an all-star level. Vooch is playing at, to me, I think Vooch is playing at an all-star level this season offensively. So they have a good core of players, but if you're getting that type of result, then it makes you wonder if you really want to continue. So with Vooch hitting free agency this offseason, DeMar entering the last year of his deal, you don't know what the future holds for really Lonzo Ball, but you're assuming maybe he plays next season. But you have a bunch of good vets. What direction would you really take the franchise in? At that point, would you really look at doing maybe a hard rebuild, or would you really look at doing a retool where you're trying to build more so around a Zach LaVine? And we talked about Patrick Williams earlier and how, he might look if he got a little bit more volume, and then you're trying to play a little bit more, a few more of the young guys, Dalen Terry hasn't, gotten some burn this season, but what direction does this team head into if they're not in a playoff spot? Or I guess even then you could argue if they do make the playoffs that you still really have the same questions overall.
Gosh, you two are asking some good questions these last couple. A tough spot. Kudos to the two of you. Yeah, that's a really tricky place to be if that's the reality. And I think whether it ends just short of the play-in, losing the play-in, or making the playoff, I think it's all going to be a pretty quick exit for the Bulls. And I think this team can be pretty dang good with Lonzo in the fold. But Lonzo in the fold is very much not something I want to bank on as much as I would love to say otherwise. It's just the reality of things, just based on what his injury and kind of the timeline and the comments surrounding it. Of course, I hope he gets back to playing basketball pain-free and all that as quickly as possible. But and so to me, I think it's worth at least, I would consider doing a retool. I would try at least maybe 1 year with LaVine as your guy, and letting Patrick Williams take on some more ball handling reps, see what Ayo can do as a second side creator, even more than we've seen this year. What does Dalen have to offer? Look to move a guy like DeMar for maybe some other players or picks that could be worthwhile there. That's kind of the direction I would go, but much like my stance on the Hawks thing, I could be easily persuaded otherwise. But just the way that Levine has been playing as of late, and the way he developed his first, what was it, kind of through the 2021 season. It'd be at least worth seeing what that looks like, and the fact that he seems to be on an upward trajectory with his knee injuries. He seems to be regaining some of that vertical explosiveness, getting downhill better than he was, say to end last year or to start this year. So that's where I would go. But again, it does kind of depend on what Levine looks like. If he's a guy that like we at least want to see, can he make that leap into top 15, top 20 type of player, or is it just going to kind of be who he is with the shaky defense, some of the decision making, some of the issues, some of the ways he sees the floor at times as a passer, and where the injury's at. So that's where I would go. But it's very much a fluid situation, and not one that I would want to actually be leading the charge on determining which route is best.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a difficult situation, and we're kind of already seeing some like flashes of it as we approach the trade deadline. Because I mean, obviously they're not going to rebuild right now, but you could also make an argument in some ways that they could be both buyers and sellers to a degree, like at this trade deadline, depending on what scenario is presented. So, like I don't expect like Zach or DeMar to get moved, but it's still an interesting situation with Vooch in the last year of his deal, and he's playing really well. Like, I don't know if a situation would arise where a team would offer you something for him with the way he's playing, and maybe it's a deal that might even fit your roster better, or maybe even improve the defense. I'm not sure, but it'll be interesting to see like how this team eventually moves long term going forward, given what they've shown this season. Jackson, it's been really great talking to you on this episode. We appreciate your knowledge of the game and dropping by to drop some gems on us with this Bulls team. Can you let our listeners know what you're working on right now and where they can follow you if they're not already doing so?
Yeah, so I'll have a piece coming out on the Raptors' defensive struggles tomorrow on SB Nation. I'm sure Bulls fans will enjoy that one because that is a team that is, generally still in the play-in contention. Yeah. And then you can follow me on Twitter at JackFrank_JJF. You can find my Sixers coverage at Liberty Ballers, my general NBA coverage at SB Nation, Dime Up Rocks, and The Analyst. I appreciate it too having me on. I think this Bulls team is in a really interesting spot, and there's definitely been a lot of pessimism around this team, but there's clearly some reasons for optimism, and I feel like I tried to summarize them pretty well, especially with Patrick Williams. So yeah, I appreciate the two having me on, and hopefully for your sake, I'll be coming on again soon, because that would mean the Bulls are playing well, given the times that I seem to make an appearance on here.
That's right. We'll have you on if they make the playoffs, and maybe that'll make them win a playoff series. Maybe
they'll beat Boston or whoever. The number one.
Yeah, they beat the good teams. Jackson.
I know. Yeah, it's total 180 from last year. They can beat them this year, which is funny. They just gotta figure out how to beat some of those lesser opponents, and maybe I would have more faith in their ability to crack the top six. But yeah, I appreciate having me on, and hopefully the Bulls continue to keep the good vibes going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely one of those seasons where I know in the past we've joked about players being bum slayers and things like that, but I would absolutely love if this team was full of bum slayers right now. Salim, any final thoughts before we wrap up, man?
Yeah, thanks again to Jackson, one of the best NBA followers, and he's always nuanced in his approach of analyzing the game. So I'm very always appreciative having him on. And yeah, let's see what the Bulls can do. I tend to be like in the same thought process as Jackson, that I don't know if they will make the playoffs, but then they kind of pull me back in when they start winning some of these games. It's like, oh no, maybe they will. I just get back and forth. They just have the tendency to do that. Surprisingly, like I was expecting them to have a dud tonight against the Pacers, but they're up 18 right now. So we'll
knock on some wood wherever you are. Get
I know, right? Just touch wood, knock on wood. Surprisingly, they're doing well. I mean, obviously, this is the type of team that Bulls have struggled. Like a team that hasn't won, and I think they're on like a 7-game losing streak, and it's just they're taking care of business right now. And now, as I speak, it's up to a 20-point lead. So we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens with this team as they keep going. And like, I'm just excited about Patrick Williams. You know, I'm happy with him, and I know there's Bulls fans that are still on his side, and there's a lot that aren't and want to already give up on him. But like I keep saying it, Pat, I believe in Patton, and then when he's going to be a really good player, I'm gonna be so obnoxious online. That's what I told you so. All that.
We gotta start an episode with a Project Pat song.
Yeah.
One of these days. Nah, it's good they're whooping up on the Pacers. I'm hoping even more so because it's like on a back-to-back. So I'm hoping that
right.
It's a sign of things to come, and they're not just saving the letdown for when I watch them Thursday in Charlotte.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that's got Hollywood script written all over it. But thank you again to Jackson Frank for stopping by and discussing the Bulls with us. As always, you can catch our past shows on the Barroom Network, on Spotify, on Apple, on Podbean, wherever you get your podcasts. And we will catch you next time, Bulls fans. So for Salim Suwala, I'm Edward Schuler. This has been Bulls Gold, and we will see you later.